On the evening of Friday, January 30th, 2004, hundreds of spectators gathered at the cinema in the center of the small town of Holland, Michigan. The theater was showing a series of popular films, but nothing like this had been seen here before. A group of high school students had presented a film they had worked on for 4 months. Its creation had stirred up a lot of emotions in the town, and the audience was eagerly awaiting the screening. Finally, the exciting moment arrived. The lights dimmed, and the opening credits appeared on the screen. The room filled with the enchanting sounds of a piano, followed by the captivating singing of a girl. One viewer, a police officer, watched what was happening on the screen with special interest, not missing a single detail. His mind was working intensely. When the film ended, the audience couldn't move, immersed in what they had just witnessed. Meanwhile, 130 kilometers away from the thunderous applause in the theater, one man was doing the same thing he did every evening. He filled a glass and drank it, trying to find oblivion at the bottom. 25 years before this, on Wednesday, January 31st, 1979, just past 2 o'clock in the morning, the phone rang at the Holland City Police Station. It was a resident of the local Blue Mill Motel who had reason to believe that a robbery had occurred. He was talking on the phone with the night porter when he heard a male voice demanding money. The responding police officers quickly determined that around $500 had disappeared from the registration desk and the office. The night porter, 22-year-old Janet Chandler, was also nowhere to be found. Her purse had vanished, her coat was hanging on a chair, and an unfinished cigarette lay in the ashtray. The likelihood that the young woman had left the motel on her own was ruled out because January was the coldest month in Michigan, and that night it was snowing heavily. She wouldn't have gone out into the cold without her coat. It was more likely that someone had taken her in a car, since there were 2 sets of footprints leading from the motel entrance into the snow. The tire tread marks confirmed it was an off-road vehicle. All evidence pointed to Janet being abducted by the robber, who probably ordered her to take her purse, assuming there might be money or other valuables inside. This scenario left the small-town police, which had never dealt with kidnappings before, baffled. It was winter and the tourist season had not yet started, but the motel was full due to a strike at a nearby factory. To protect the factory property and the employees who wanted to continue working, the factory had hired a security firm, and all 80 security guards were staying at the motel. However, despite the large number of residents, there were no witnesses to the abduction. The police knew how important it was to work quickly if they wanted to find Janet alive, but they had no idea where to begin the search. Nonetheless, they quickly positioned patrol cars on the roads to prevent anyone from leaving town unnoticed. The search for the abducted girl began. In the early hours of January 31st, Jim and Glenna Chandler were awakened by a phone call. It was a police officer who briefly explained the situation to Janet's parents. They vehemently dismissed the notion that their daughter might have run away with someone. If Janet had disappeared in the middle of her shift without explanation, something terrible must have happened. Jim Chandler blamed himself for everything. He had recently visited his daughter at work and noticed individuals at the motel whom he strongly disliked. Now he regretted not asking his daughter who they were. Overall, Jim and Glenna believed that their daughter might have found part-time work elsewhere. She had previously studied nursing and worked with children, which suited her personality better. But Janet was eager to earn money and gain some independence. Moreover, her best friend and roommate, Lori Ann Swank, worked at the motel. Therefore, after careful consideration, her parents concluded that their daughter was mature and sensible enough to make the right decisions. Around 1:30 a.m. on February 1st, a snowplow driver was clearing a road about 50 kilometers south of Holland. When his headlights caught a snow-covered turnoff to a neighboring town, he noticed something strange: tire tracks leading into dense wooded terrain. The driver got out of his vehicle into the frigid air and followed the tracks, which led him to a snowdrift. There, beneath a tree, a horrifying scene unfolded before him. It was Janet Chandler. She had been subjected to brutal violence and strangled, most likely with a rope, wire, or belt. Her hands and feet were bound, and her mouth was sealed with tape, but there were no ropes or tape found on or near her body. All of her personal belongings, including her purse, jewelry, watch, and driver's license, were missing. She had been killed 6 hours before her body was discovered, but her body had been left in the snow shortly before the snowplow driver arrived. This case was beyond the capabilities of the town's police force. Therefore, dozens of law enforcement officers were dispatched from Michigan to coordinate the search in the area where Janet was found. Helicopters and search teams scoured the area. Rewards were offered for any information about the crime, and motorists were asked to report any suspicious vehicles in the vicinity where the girl was left. At the same time, the police interviewed Janet's relatives and friends. The college student had no enemies. She was passionate about music and aspired to sing in the opera one day. She had grown up in a loving family and most of her friends were from the church. Although she had dated guys, her family stated that she had not been in any serious relationships. They couldn't recall a single person who would want to harm her. 2 weeks later, the strikes at the factory came to an end, and all the security guards dispersed to their homes. The town became much quieter, but the investigation continued. The reward was increased to $3,000. The police re-interviewed colleagues, friends, and family of the girl, as well as motel residents. There was no hint as to who might have targeted the girl and why. Could she have become a random victim of a stranger? This case remained a mystery and was put on the back burner, although the officers couldn't completely forget about it. Janet's photo always remained pinned to the board in the police station, in the hope that her killer would be found someday. David Schock, a professor at Hope College, always impressed his students with interesting creative assignments. As a former journalist, he believed it would be beneficial for his students to establish good relations with law enforcement agencies. So, in 2003, Professor Schock organized a meeting with a detective from the Holland Police for a group of 8 students. During the meeting, the professor asked the detective if there was a case he dreamt of solving. Without hesitation, the detective pointed to the photo of Janet Chandler that had been pinned to the board in the police station for over 20 years. An idea immediately popped into the professor's head. What if his students created a documentary film about Janet's life? They could interview her family and the people who worked on the case. Ideally, this could help uncover new leads, and even if it didn't, it would still be an interesting educational tool for the students and a way to honor the memory of the brutally murdered girl. The project got the green light, and the professor quickly got his students involved in the work, arranging interviews. One of the students, 21-year-old Sarah Hatman, was excited to work on the film, but nervous about the prospect of interviewing the victim's parents. However, when they met Jim and Glenna Chandler in their home, their anxiety quickly dissipated. The elderly couple proved to be very welcoming and friendly, despite their own grief. They fondly spoke about their daughter, reminiscing about various moments in her life, like when neighbors gathered under their windows to listen to Janet sing. Despite the passage of 24 years, they still grieved deeply, and as elderly individuals, they believed they might not live to see their daughter's killer brought to justice. It didn't take long for the students to become personally invested in the case. They spoke with those who knew Janet, and the more they learned about her, the more they wanted to uncover the truth. 4 months later, the documentary film Who Killed Janet Chandler was presented to the public. The chief of the local police was also in the audience, unable to contain his emotions. A quarter of a century ago, he had been a young officer, and now, seeing Janet's family appeal for justice, he felt obligated to take action. He reached out to the Michigan State Police, and they agreed to reopen the case. By April 2004, a team led by David Van Lopik, a detective who had grown up in Holland and remembered the case well, had been officially formed. Despite technological advancements, there was no DNA or fingerprints to work with. However, they were determined to examine every lead, every hint about the perpetrator. The documentary painted a vivid picture of Janet's life, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. By learning who Janet truly was, beyond what her parents and teachers had said, they hoped to find the crucial clue they needed. Using the documentary as a tool, investigators hoped to compel people to talk. Digging a bit deeper, investigators unexpectedly discovered that shortly after Janet enrolled in college, something happened that shook her faith. She was seduced by an older man. Although she had always regarded intimate relationships before marriage as a sin, she decided to cross that line with him. Soon, they were regularly meeting at her parents' house when they were not at home. Their relationship continued for over a year, and Janet's parents never found out. But the relationship permanently changed her. She realized she could sin and not be punished for it. Her world began to change as she pushed the boundaries she had once tried so hard to uphold. Feeling that he was onto something, David Van Lopik turned to the person who knew Janet best, her best friend, Lori Swank. Lori had left town shortly after the murder and severed all ties with her former acquaintances. Lori fondly remembered Janet as a talented musician, but under pressure, she admitted that her friend was not so innocent. During their time working at the motel, the girls didn't always behave impeccably and became involved with the motel's security guards, who loved to host parties in the rooms. Sometimes things got out of control. Once, Janet invited one of the security guards to the registration desk. When he went downstairs, she was waiting for him in the neighboring office, wearing only cowboy boots. Lori, who was officially her supervisor, had to reprimand her. The detective increasingly realized that the motel in January 1979 was a place where wild parties never ceased. This meant that the crime could have been committed by someone with a connection to it. Investigators compiled a list of motel guests. Most of them were security guards who had left town after the strike, and as a result, the police had never interviewed them. Finding them 25 years later was not easy. Some barely remembered Janet because they had come to Holland to work, not to have fun. Detectives showed them the documentary film, hoping to jog their memories, but in most cases, it was futile. That was the case until Harry Kitt watched the film. Harry worked as a security guard but was also an amateur photographer. While watching the film, he recognized one of the pictures of Janet, which he had taken himself. And it wasn't just one picture. Harry retrieved an old album with photos from parties. In one photo, Janet was sitting on the lap of a security guard, holding a glass and wearing his uniform. It turned out to be none other than Robert Lynch, the very guest who had reported the robbery. In 1979, Lynch was nearly 40 years old. Due to his age, he rarely attended parties. Over the past 25 years, he managed to get married, become the father of 2 children, and open a beauty school with his wife. Detectives found him in the small town of Three Oaks, located 130 kilometers south of Holland. There was no reason to believe that the now 65-year-old Lynch, a law-abiding citizen, had any connection to the crime. However, pictures of Harry indicated that the two definitely knew each other. Furthermore, after listening to a recording of a man's call to the police, detectives had new questions. The man reported an ongoing robbery, but his voice lacked any emotion. Could the call have been staged? However, talking to Lynch was not easy. He provided evasive answers and claimed to have a poor memory of that period of his life. This, by the way, was easy to believe considering how often he turned to alcohol. Without any evidence, they couldn't connect him to the crime. Yet when interrogating other people, investigators kept circling back to Lynch. Maybe it was just a hunch, but they couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. But how to approach him? He appeared to be a model family man with no legal problems, but his addiction to alcohol indicated a desire to forget something. Detectives hoped that if they continued to press him, cracks would appear in his armor. Their strategy paid off. In June 2005, Lynch finally admitted that he had entered into a relationship with Janet, despite the fact that he was 17 years older than her. Lynch also recalled that on the day of the murder, Janet attended a party that went awry. He stated that he didn't know anything more, but for the investigators, this was a significant revelation. Despite many years and several interrogations, this was the first time they had heard about such a party. Still convinced that Lynch knew more than he was saying, Detective Van Lopik visited him again a few months later. He was accompanied by a colleague known for expertly conducting interrogations and had a reputation for breaking even the most resilient suspects. This time, Van Lopik brought his secret weapon, a film. Lynch watched with difficulty as Janet's father spoke about his daughter, holding back tears. The detective paused the film, turned to Lynch and said, "You have children, don't you? Do you remember that one time when you took them somewhere and lost them? Do you remember that growing sense of fear inside you? Your daughter is the same age Janet was. If she were murdered, wouldn't you want to know the truth?" Tears welled up in Lynch's eyes. It took 4 months and 18 interrogations for Lynch to finally reveal what happened at the off-kilter party. Shortly before 2 a.m. on January 31st, 1979, Lynch and another security guard, James Nelson, descended to the first floor. Janet was working at the registration desk. James informed Janet that they were throwing a surprise party in her honor. She was told it would take place in a guest house on the factory premises where the head security guard, Arthur Carl Paiva, was stationed. The men restrained Janet's hands behind her back and placed handcuffs on her. According to Lynch, Janet didn't object. She also allowed them to blindfold her. The idea to create the appearance of a robbery belonged to Lynch. While Janet couldn't see, the men took all the cash and led her to a car parked outside. Several other security guards and motel maids were on the balcony, watching as the guards led Janet outside. They were well aware of the plan the men intended to carry out. Once they had taken Janet away, Lynch called 911 and reported a robbery. Afterward, he returned to his room and went to sleep, preparing for his shift at the factory. When he left work around 6 p.m., he quickly freshened up and went to join the other conspirators. There were already 15 to 20 guests present, including 6 women. Janet was among them. Completely naked, she sat on the couch, staring into nothingness. Her hands were bound and her mouth was sealed with tape. The people around her were joyfully celebrating. Then a few people exchanged glances as if suggesting to continue her humiliation. A security guard named Freddie Parker fastened his belt around Janet's neck and led her upstairs to a bedroom. Several other men followed them. They threw Janet on the bed, covering her eyes with tape. Around half a dozen men took turns tormenting her. The decision about who was allowed to participate was made by Arthur Paiva. It was his idea to tighten the belt around her neck, intensifying her suffering. Nelson, Lynch, and Parker followed his example. They strangled Janet with the belt to ensure she had no strength to resist. None of the 20 guests did anything to stop them. Instead, they encouraged and cheered on the attackers. Among them was Janet's best friend, Lori, who shouted insults at her while watching her ordeal. Lynch was the last to climb onto Janet and pinned her to the bed with his knees. He whispered obscenities to her, struck her, and tightened the belt even tighter. His memory of what happened next was hazy. Someone shouted that Janet wasn't breathing. Realizing that Janet was dead, the men panicked. Arthur threw a chair against the wall and yelled that the party was over. Incredibly, upon learning of what had just happened upstairs, all the other guests rushed to clean up the crime scene. They knew the police were already searching for Janet, and they needed to get rid of her quickly. They removed the tape from Janet's mouth, washed her, wrapped her in a sheet, and placed her in a car. Under the cover of night, Lynch drove about 40 miles north, parked the car on the side of the road, and left Janet's body in a snowdrift. 2 weeks later, the strike ended, and the security guards had no reason to stay in town. The men dispersed, swearing never to speak of what happened in the town. Many of them never crossed paths again. But Janet's murder haunted Lynch wherever he went. He began to drink, desperately trying to erase that night from his memory. Now, knowing what happened to Janet, investigators were even more tormented by the question, why? What compelled all these people to kill Janet in the most brutal way possible? Armed with Lynch's confession, detectives went to Lori Swank. They couldn't fathom how Janet's best friend not only witnessed the abuse, but also encouraged it. When pressured, Lori had to admit that she had been part of the plan from the beginning. It all began when Janet started dating a security guard who had also been involved with one of the motel maids. The betrayed girl was furious, and she and Janet had a loud argument about it. Lori herself was in love with Arthur, and it upset her to see Janet spending time with him too. She was angry and wanted revenge. Lori told Arthur that he wasn't the only one Janet was involved with, which infuriated him. After talking to other security guards and motel maids who were also resentful of Janet, they devised a plan to humiliate her and teach her a lesson. They all believed she had gotten too conceited and needed to be put in her place. After Lynch and Lori's confessions, the other partygoers at the gathering stopped keeping quiet. In total, it took the investigative team 2.5 years to uncover the whole truth. They were astonished by one thing: how many people were involved in the crime or its cover-up and had kept silent for nearly 30 years. It seemed incredible that no one had confessed earlier. Former motel maids claimed that the men had threatened them, and one woman was allegedly visited regularly by them to ensure her silence. There was also another possible explanation for their silence. Purportedly, incriminating photos of everyone present at the party existed, and Arthur would use them to blackmail any potential informants. However, if such photos existed, they were never found. Despite the involvement of around 12 people in the planning or immediate violence, prosecutors only charged 6 of them: Lynch, Lori, Arthur, Nelson, Parker, and Anthony Williams, based on the most reliable testimonies. All the men, except for Lynch, claimed that they were not at the party in the guest house and had no connection to the crime. Lynch himself sought forgiveness from Janet's parents and confessed everything in court in exchange for a second-degree murder charge. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. However, he couldn't testify against the other accomplices due to dementia that developed as a result of alcohol abuse. In exchange for a second-degree murder charge, Laurie provided testimony against the others. On October 17, 2007, Laurie detailed step-by-step everything that had happened, from the planning to the execution. She didn't withhold anything, fully admitting her role in the conspiracy. She confessed that jealousy had driven her because Janet was more popular among men than she was. Since there were no physical evidence, the case heavily relied on Laurie's testimony, but her words were backed up by 2 motel maids who knew about the plan and were at the party, and Arthur's former girlfriend, a factory worker who participated in the strike, provided him with an alibi. The women remembered how dreadful Janet looked. She was terrified while the men took turns abusing her. Occasionally, she would regain consciousness and try to escape. The rest of the time, she sat with a vacant stare as if she had been given some kind of prohibited substances. However, toxicological analysis didn't find anything unusual in her system. This vacant stare was likely a physical reaction to shock. On November 1st, the jury found all 4 guilty and sentenced them to life in prison. After the trial, Jim Chandler stated that, as a Christian, he might have forgiven the men, but for that to happen, they needed to ask for forgiveness, and none of these arrogant individuals had shown remorse or asked for forgiveness. Glenna added that she felt sorry for the parents and families of the men, but not for the men themselves. All the appeals from the convicted were denied. In 2016, Laurie was released on parole after serving her sentence. Arthur died in prison after serving only 5 years. In June 2020, Nelson passed away. As for the students who worked on the documentary film Who Killed Janet Chandler, nothing could have prepared them for what transpired as a result of their project. However, they admit that it taught them to value life much more. Their creative inspiration, Professor Shook, left teaching and founded the company Deferred Justice, dedicated to shedding light on other unsolved crimes. His company has already succeeded in securing convictions in another murder case. Striving for justice and closure for families, Shook operates on the principle that someone knows something. There's always someone who knows something.
A large-scale festival held in Brittany, France, in 2005 drew over 40,000 attendees. But when a body was discovered in the woods early one morning, those 40,000 visitors suddenly became 40,000 suspects. A massive investigation was launched, but it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. To the police, anyone at the event could have been the killer. They would conduct dozens of interviews, run hundreds of DNA tests, and despite numerous setbacks, they would eventually track down the murderer, a person of small stature and an out-of-control imagination. In June 2005, the small French village of Carnouet hosted a massive electronic music festival called Technival. In fact, this festival had been taking place for several consecutive years. But until then, it had always been an unsanctioned, spontaneous event. The government, realizing it couldn't put a stop to Technival, made a logical decision. If you can't beat it, take control of it. Authorities aimed to bring order to such gatherings and decided to participate alongside the organizers. Around 1,000 gendarmes were deployed at Technival, many of them in plain clothes, so as not to attract unnecessary attention. At the height of Technival, on the morning of Sunday, June 26th, 2 young women who had gone into a spruce grove to relieve themselves stumbled upon something unexpected. Other festival goers had done the same, so the girls were careful where they stepped to avoid anything unpleasant. Suddenly, they noticed bare feet sticking out from beneath the bushes. At first, they thought someone had simply lain down to rest. But as they looked closer, they realized the feet belonged to a young woman who was most certainly not sleeping. Judging by her appearance, nothing could be done to help her. The sight was truly horrifying. The friends ran to alert the gendarmes. Since law enforcement was already present at the event, the investigation that followed unfolded very quickly. Following the witnesses' directions, the gendarmes found the body. It belonged to a young woman, no older than 20. She was lying on her back, legs apart, covered in blood. Her pants and underwear had been removed and were lying nearby. Her t-shirt and bra were pulled up over her chest. The girl had clearly been the victim of a brutal murder. Moreover, the position of the body and the state of her clothing strongly suggested sexual assault. In the pocket of her pants was a set of car keys with a fish-shaped keychain. She had nothing else on her. No bag, no identification. For some reason, her shoes were also missing. There was nothing that could help identify her. And at that point, no one had reported a young woman missing from the festival. The forensic investigators had to begin collecting evidence, but that was easier said than done. Before them stretched an enormous crime scene. The Technival grounds covered 60 hectares of fields and forests. According to estimates, over the course of the three-day festival, 43,000 people attended. At the time the body was discovered, around 24,000 people were still present on site. All of them had been frequenting the forest bordering the festival grounds. And as a result, the ground was littered with excrement, toilet paper, wet wipes, tissues, tampons, and condoms. Determining what among all this might be connected to the crime was nearly impossible. It was crucial not to overlook anything important while also filtering out irrelevant material. The forensic team started by collecting evidence found as close to the victim's body as possible. Among the items was a condom wrapper stained with brown marks, which, as would later be confirmed, were blood. But at that point, they still didn't know whether this wrapper was related to the girl. The police didn't even know the victim's name yet, and they were surprised that no one had noticed her disappearance. It wasn't until later in the evening that two girls, sisters Sophie and Marie-Aude, approached the gendarmes providing security at the festival. They reported that they hadn't seen their cousins since early that morning. The girls had arrived the night before with a large group, partied nearly until dawn, and decided to rest and get some sleep before heading home. That was the last time they saw their cousin. They added that they were already overdue to leave, but their cousin had the car keys. At that remark, the gendarmes grew alert and asked the girls to take them to the vehicle. There, they tried the keys found in the victim's pocket. The key fit, and the car door opened. The police now knew the victim's name: Matilda Kroganek. The girl was 18 years old and lived a few dozen kilometers from the village of Carnoy, where the festival was held. Her parents were divorced. She lived with her mother, stepfather, and younger sister. Despite the separation, Matilda maintained a great relationship with her father. The entire family was close. They loved and supported one another. In general, Matilda was very sociable, excelled in school, loved horseback riding, and planned to become a riding instructor in the near future. About 6 months earlier, she had started dating a young man named Adrian. Technival was the first event of such scale that her parents had allowed her to attend. They were reassured by the fact that the event was secured by the government. Additionally, she was going with her boyfriend, her cousins, and a group of friends. The group was large, and that gave her parents peace of mind. They believed that Matilda would be safe. On Saturday, Matilda and her friends got into their cars and headed to the festival. Matilda and her cousins were in one vehicle, while 4 boys, including Adrian, rode in another. The friends planned to spend the entire night at the festival and return home on Sunday evening. On the night from Saturday to Sunday, Matilda contacted her mother and stepfather. She assured them that the whole group was having a great time, and they truly were. Eventually, feeling tired, Adrian and Matilda decided to get some sleep. The friends split up around 8:30 in the morning. 3 hours later, Sophie and Marie-Aude ran into Adrian. He was alone. Up until that point, Matilda had always been with him, but now she was nowhere to be seen. Adrian was holding Matilda's shoes and backpack. The girls asked him where Matilda was, and he replied that she was sleeping in the parking area. But she wasn't there. The sisters waited for their cousin at the agreed spot for a while, but when she didn't show up, they decided to go to the gendarme. They asked Adrian to come with them, but he refused. What's more, his voice sounded irritated, as if their request had annoyed him. The girls went to the gendarmes on their own. The officers questioned them about their evening. The sisters said that before Matilda disappeared, they hadn't noticed anything unusual. They couldn't recall any strangers hanging around her who might have seemed suspicious. By Sunday, the police had already made their first arrests. First, they detained a man from Poland who was found nearly naked and covered in blood, but he turned out to be uninvolved. It was discovered that he had taken illegal substances, and when he saw the police, he abruptly yanked out a syringe, injuring himself in the process, hence the blood. The police also detained a young man who had been harassing attractive female festival-goers. Several of them had pointed him out. He was identified, located, and questioned. However, the young man firmly denied ever coming into contact with Matilda. In an effort to prove his innocence in the murder case, he confessed to sexually assaulting another girl during the festival. Yet the police were unable to act on this admission, as no woman had reported an assault during Technival, so this man also had to be released. Nevertheless, DNA samples were taken from both of them, just in case. At first glance, it seemed that the investigators were faced with an impossible task. More than 40,000 people had attended the Technival. Over 40,000 potential suspects moving chaotically across a vast area, dancing, drinking alcohol, and using illegal substances. Considering that rumors tend to spread at lightning speed in such situations, and that people might soon start fleeing the festival, the police decided to block all the roads. Of course, there was a possibility that someone who hadn't been attending the event had attacked Mathilde, someone who simply took advantage of the opportunity. However, the police were almost 100% certain that her killer was a festival goer. By blocking the roads, the police were able to check documents and record the names of all those leaving. They registered the details of about 26,000 people. Naturally, they realized that some might have slipped through, but they had to start somewhere, and it was important to collect as many names of potential suspects as possible. By Sunday evening, the police had already identified the victim and collected evidence at the crime scene. However, certain details led them to suspect that it might not have been the actual scene of the crime, or at least not where the attack had started. There was too little blood for the kind of severe injuries the girl had sustained. Using luminol, officers were able to trace a trail of blood left behind by the girl as she tried to flee her attacker. Eventually, the police found a clearing where a bottle of water with traces of blood was lying. This indicated that Mathilde had been attacked in that clearing and then tried to escape, but the killer caught up with her and murdered her at the spot where her body was later discovered. The police focused on the victim's boyfriend, Adrian. His behavior seemed suspicious, and some of his actions couldn't be explained. Like Mathilde's cousins, Adrian didn't find his girlfriend at the festival, but instead of getting worried, he simply went home. However, since the keys to his car were with Mathilde, he walked to the nearest road, hitched a ride, and got back to his hometown. The police had many questions. Why did he leave by hitchhiking without checking where Mathilde was? Why didn't he search for her? Why didn't he at least try to get the car keys back? He left when news had already spread at the festival that a girl's body had been found in the woods. Interestingly, to his friends at the festival, Adrian said that Mathilde had left, but when he arrived home, he claimed that the girl had stayed at the festival. Of course, the young man was invited to the police station. He came with his parents, and the police immediately understood the reason for his behavior. He had clearly been using illegal substances and was in no state to collect his thoughts. The young man didn't even know where he was. It was literally impossible to have a conversation with him. To every question, he answered, "I don't know, I don't remember, I don't know." He remembered that at some point Mathilde disappeared. He got tired of waiting for her, and he decided to go home by hitchhiking. His mind was so clouded that at one point he admitted that he might have killed Mathilde, but he didn't even remember doing it. However, the detectives doubted that he was involved in the crime. Overall, the police had the right to keep him at the station for 48 hours. But the investigators didn't have to spend the entire time of the suspect's detention all at once. Therefore, they took a DNA sample from Adrian and released him, planning to bring him back to the station if necessary. The autopsy results and toxicology report came in. They found alcohol and a range of illegal substances in Mathilde's system, which likely didn't come as a big surprise to the pathologist. However, the brutality of the crime shocked him. He counted at least 28 stab wounds, 15 of which were fatal. The victim died from strangulation and blood loss, as the killer had stabbed her in the abdomen and chest and also slashed her throat. She had injuries on her arms, indicating that the girl had tried to defend herself. As for the sexual assault, the pathologist could not conclusively determine if she had been raped, but he found signs that her intimate parts had been touched. Thus, the pathologist confirmed that the victim had been killed with a knife. Detectives suspected that the killer might have discarded the weapon in a trash bin or somewhere in the forest near the crime scene. Therefore, they brought in dog handlers and began combing the woods. The officers were moving on all fours, as it was the only way to navigate through the thick underbrush. But at some point, one of them shouted, "Knife!" Beneath a tree, there indeed was a knife with an unusual handle. So the police gathered several pieces of evidence in the forest. However, they placed particular hope on the condom wrapper, the bottle, and the knife, because blood was found on all three items. The first test, which came in August, confirmed the presence of the victim's DNA on the neck of the bottle. The condom wrapper contained male DNA, but there was no match for this man in the database. The killer had evidently wiped the blade of the knife, and only Mathilde's blood was found on it. Usually the lab would stop there, but not this time. Since the knife had a very interesting handle with holes, the lab workers decided to dismantle it and search for DNA on the inner side of the handle. Indeed, they found male epithelial DNA, skin microtissue. The DNA matched the one found on the condom wrapper. Now they had the killer's DNA. Once they identified its owner, they would also learn his name. The DNA was compared to samples from 2 festival attendees who had been detained on the first day of the investigation, as well as with Mathilde's boyfriend, Adrian. The samples did not match. Searching for a killer who had attended a large-scale festival was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but the police decided to focus on the murder weapon. The knife appeared quite unusual and apparently wasn't very common. Detectives investigated whether it could have been purchased in the area of the Carnoët commune where the festival took place. It turned out that these knives were manufactured in Taiwan and then imported to France by a local company. The company informed the police that they had imported over 200 knives, distributing them to various stores. In particular, they had a retail outlet in the town of Mont-Saint-Michel near the Technival festival site. The store provided the police with receipts, and officers spent weeks going through them, cross-checking with the price of the knife. But they quickly realized they wouldn't be able to track down all the buyers, as not everyone paid by card. But they had something else. There was no phone found near the victim's body in the forest, although she definitely had one, as she had sent a message to her parents. The police assumed the killer had taken the phone. They couldn't locate it, but the last activity from the phone had been recorded in the commune of Châteauneuf-d'Ille-et-Vilaine. However, 3 months later, in September 2005, the phone appeared on the network again, but with a different SIM card. The police quickly determined who had the phone. It was another festival goer. The police knew this for sure because her name was on the list of people who were checked upon leaving the festival. The police had recorded information about which car she was in, and in that car were several other young people. One of them particularly caught the attention of the police because he had been involved in sexual offenses. The detectives were convinced they had found the killer. They immediately traveled to the address where Mathilde's phone had been found. But the young people claimed they had simply found the phone during the festival. They decided that since no one had claimed it, they could keep it. DNA samples were taken from the group of friends who had been in the car and took the phone, but they did not match the killer's DNA. The only mistake these people made was not turning the phone over to the police, but they had no connection to Mathilde's murder. It was another dead end. 6 months after Mathilde's death, her father died. He was still a relatively young and healthy man, so no one doubted that he died of grief. He had fallen into despair when he learned that his only daughter had been brutally murdered and couldn't bear it. The investigating judge really wanted to give the family answers to their tormenting questions. He had already conducted a DNA analysis of all the men living in the region to rule out that possibility. He even considered collecting DNA samples from all the male visitors of Technival, but that would cost a fortune. Therefore, before resorting to this extreme measure, the police decided to investigate the last lead. The detectives noted one interesting detail. All hooligans have a tendency to take selfies on their phones. In particular, among the pictures taken by Adrian, Mathilde's boyfriend, they saw 2 young men who were not close friends of the girl. No one in the group even knew their names. The police quickly established that one of the young men was a fire eater, entertaining festival guests. He had no connection to the crime. However, the identity of the second young man was unknown to the police. He appeared in 2 of Adrian's photos. One shot was taken on the 25th just before midnight, and the second around 7 a.m. on the 26th. Despite the fact that Mathilde spent most of the evening with her group, no one knew this young man. The detectives didn't know how to identify him. They circulated the photo among various police departments, but nothing came of it. The detective would say that in any investigation, hard work is important, but so is luck. In this case, luck smiled on the investigation on May 23, 2006. A young man came to the police station in the city of Rennes to give a statement. He was accused of petty fraud. While waiting for the interrogation, he sat and stared at the clock and old posters on the walls when his gaze fell on the photo of the young man from the festival, the one who was photographed next to Mathilde. He told the police officer that he knew him. They had served together as sailors on the cruiser Jeanne d'Arc. It didn't come to him right away, but eventually he managed to recall his name, Alain Carnoët. However, the police had made so many mistakes in the case by this point that they decided not to rush into joy. They requested a photo of Alain from the Admiralty and compared the facial features of the sailor and the man in the photograph. The expert concluded that the facial features matched. From the Admiralty, they learned that Alain had left the cruiser 3 days before the murder and had resigned 2 days after the murder. He was currently living with his mother in Marseille. He had been at the Technival Festival, as his name appeared on the list of people who had been checked on the road. But the most interesting part was that Alain was accused of a sexual crime in Brest on February 7, 2006, which was 8 months after Mathilde's death. He had been sitting in his car and engaging in self-pleasure when a young woman walked by. He tried to follow her, but the girl was quicker and escaped from him. However, she managed to write down the number of his car. When he was detained, he calmly admitted that he often did something similar in the car. After reviewing his bank statements, investigators saw that a couple of days before the festival, he had made a purchase at a weapons store in Mont Saint-Michel. He bought a knife similar to the murder weapon. Alain Carnoa quickly became the prime suspect. The police wanted to arrest Alain, but it turned out that he had gone to Poland, the country of his girlfriend. They waited for 2 weeks for his return to France. Finally, on June 22, 2006, he was arrested at his mother's house in Marseille. He reacted to the arrest completely calmly, behaved politely, and the detectives began to think that they might have been wrong again. The young man had no objections to the search of his room. During the search, they found several types of weapons, including knives and shurikens. But much more important was the fact that he had a printout of a prescription for a forbidden substance used by rapists. Alain explained this by saying that he was simply curious about it, wanted to see what it was for and how to use it, but he had never used it. Alain did not object to giving a DNA sample, and while the detectives were talking to him at the station, the sample was immediately sent to the laboratory. Meanwhile, the young man explained that he had been at the Technival Festival. After a party on the beach in Brest, he met 2 young men who told him they were going to the festival, and it was going to be a summer fiesta. So he decided to go there as well. He enjoyed the festival, drank, and socialized with people. Initially, Alain said he didn't remember Mathilde, but when they showed him photographs, he recalled talking to her. He claimed that he and Mathilde wanted to make love, so they went into the woods. But when they began kissing, they were attacked by 3 strangers. They beat them, and then one of the men took Alain's hand, put a knife in it, and used it to stab Mathilde in the stomach. After that, Alain ran away. The DNA results came in, and Alain's sample matched the DNA found on the condom wrapper and on the knife. But the detectives decided not to tell the suspect this just yet. The interrogation was interrupted at that point. Alain was allowed to rest, and the next morning, the conversation resumed. The atmosphere in the interrogation room had clearly changed. Alain shared that he had dreamed of a lady in white, and suddenly red spots began to spread on her. 1, then 2, then 3, 4, and 5. After this, Alain gradually began to tell his version of the events from that day. It was closer to the truth, although it was clear that Alain didn't tell the whole story. According to him, that day he and Mathilde went into the woods to make love. They began kissing when Alain took out a knife and stabbed her 2 or 3 times in the stomach. When asked what had caused him to suddenly attack the girl, he couldn't explain. Mathilde screamed at him to stop, slapped him, and ran toward the road. Alain caught up with her and grabbed her by the arms, slashing her throat with the knife. When he realized that they could be seen, he dragged Mathilde to the other side of the stream, behind the reeds. Despite having stabbed her multiple times, he still had the desire to sexually assault her. Alain stripped the victim naked and tried to put on a condom. However, he couldn't get an erection, so he touched her with his hand. At that moment, he claimed he came to his senses, as if waking up from a dream, realized what he had done, and ran away through the woods. The murderer threw away the knife and joined his friends. At the end of the day, like all other festival attendees, he was stopped by the gendarmes at the exit from the Technival. He went to Brest and literally the next day returned to his old life. On the street, he met Katarzyna, a pretty student from Poland. They started dating, and since then, they had never been apart. The police found that 25-year-old Alain grew up in a completely normal, middle-class family. It was a fairly well-off family. His mother worked at the post office, and his father had been a sailor, building a career in the Navy, though now he was retired. His parents were divorced, but the relationships within the family were close and trusting. Alain spoke a lot about his parents and his sister, who was about to get married in the coming days. It seemed as though he was more concerned about his sister's wedding than about the murder charges against him. According to psychiatrists, the only thing that seemed to trouble Alain was an inferiority complex related to his height. As a child, he had undergone hormone treatments to grow taller, yet his height still stagnated at 160 centimeters, which deeply upset him. Alain himself said that he felt like a gorilla due to his stocky build and abundant body hair. This complex had a significant impact on him, leading him to withdraw from his friends, eventually seeking refuge in video games, which he began playing at the age of 14 or 15. He became dependent on them, found an outlet in them, completely retreated into a parallel world. He was so immersed in his fantasies that he wanted to transfer them into the real world, telling his friends and other sailors about his achievements and adventures. And the situation was not helped by the fact that other sailors called him a child molester. When he served on the ship, during stops, he was interested in very young girls of easy virtue, 13, 14 years old, and was often cruel to them. He bragged to his fellow sailors about the disgusting things he had done. And when the National Navy sent a cruiser to help the tsunami victims, including to pick up the bodies of the dead, he said he might have desecrated the bodies. The other sailors didn't know whether to believe him or not, whether he was joking or telling the terrible truth. In October, during a terrible storm, the investigating judge conducted a crime scene reenactment. At first, Alain cooperated with the investigation, but when he was handed a mannequin and a mock knife, he was unable to explain what happened next or reconstruct his actions. He requested the actual murder weapon, hoping it might help him make more progress. Naturally, the judge refused. During the reenactment, Alain essentially explained that during the killing, he felt as though he were inside a video game. The gruesome scene that unfolded in the forest became a video game in his mind, and he was controlling the characters. Nevertheless, psychiatrists concluded that he was fully aware of his actions. The investigating judge charged him with murder and desecration of a corpse, as Alain had attempted to sexually assault Mathilde after inflicting the fatal wounds. However, Alain appealed this charge. As a result, the desecration charge was replaced with sexual assault, which is a more serious crime. The punishment for murder committed before or after sexual violence is life imprisonment. The trial began. Mathilde's mother, stepfather, and sister were present in court, devastated but eager to learn what had happened that day, to hear it from the killer himself. But their hopes were dashed. During the proceedings, Alain claimed he couldn't remember committing the crime. He was unable to explain why he had drawn a knife and attacked the girl when, according to him, they were kissing and about to make love. He remembered the chase, the stabbing, but nothing more. In truth, no one believed that Mathilde had followed Alain into the forest for intimacy. It was far more likely that he had been watching her all night, waiting for her to find a secluded spot to relieve herself. And that's when he attacked. During the trial, Alain caused even more pain to the victim's family. He paid no attention to Mathilde's mother or stepfather, but couldn't take his eyes off the girl's 16-year-old sister. His gaze was disturbingly intense and entirely inappropriate. Even when he was admonished, he couldn't look away. Eventually, the poor girl couldn't take it anymore. She ran out of the courtroom, overcome with emotion. Outside, she began to scream, unable to contain her anguish. But the courtroom was stifling, the windows were open, and everyone inside could hear her desperate cries. After 5 days, Alain Crenoa was found guilty. When he was sentenced to life in prison, he collapsed to his knees and wept. It seemed he had only then realized that the trial was not a joke, and that he would not be walking free anytime soon. Thus, the jury reminded him once more that life is not a game. However, Alain appealed the verdict, and the appellate court did not agree that his actions were premeditated. As a result, his sentence was reduced from life imprisonment to 30 years. He must serve at least 20 years before becoming eligible for parole. Alain Crenoa is likely to be released as early as 2026. His life story is that of a once beloved child, a bright and capable student who could have had a promising naval career like his father. Instead, he built his life on lies. He fabricated all kinds of wild adventures to impress others, to make people forget his small stature. Gradually, he withdrew into the world of video games, a virtual reality where anything was possible, even murder. He was still lost in that world when he attacked Mathilde. At least that's what he told the jury in an attempt to justify his actions. The problem is, Mathilde is truly dead. She paid with her life for his fantasies.
The morning of December 26, 2014, started for the employees of the DoubleTree Hotel in Portland, Oregon, just like any other day. In the midst of the holiday season, at a conveniently located hotel across from a large shopping center, it was hard to find an available room. Guests were coming and going. It was during this time that someone from the staff found the body of a young woman on the staircase. She was dressed inappropriately for the season, had no identification on her, and at first glance, it seemed like she might have accidentally fallen down the stairs, but only at first glance. When detectives began piecing together the fragments of this unusual case, they made a series of unsettling discoveries. They would have to contend with 3 potential suspects, a mysterious double-faced guest, and a victim with a dark secret. 24-year-old Ashley Benson always seemed like a very happy person. Until the age of 13, she lived in Montana with her mother and then moved to the suburbs of Portland, Oregon to live with her father, Michael, and stepmother, Jody. She had wonderful relationships with her father, and soon, she genuinely grew to love her stepmother. The move was a significant change in the girl's life, but it turned out to be beneficial for her. In Portland, she blossomed. She spent a lot of time with her family, loved outdoor activities, and made many friends at school. Friends adored her for her easygoing nature, infectious laughter, and kindness. One of her friends recalls that Ashley was one of those people who would give you the shirt off her back. But at the age of 17, her life took a sharp turn. She gave birth to a son, whom they named after the child's father, Marlon, her boyfriend of 2 years. Despite their young age, Ashley and Marlon tried to raise the child together. At first, everything seemed fine, but in 2008, after finishing school, they moved in together. And when the young family was left to fend for themselves, things became difficult. Ashley had always wanted to pursue higher education, but had to give up on her dream so they could support themselves financially. Unfortunately, the young parents couldn't cope with the challenges and eventually separated. Her son remained living with Ashley. The situation she found herself in was very challenging, but she managed. She found housing for herself and her son, took on any odd jobs she could find, and slowly got back on her feet. Over the next few years, the young woman dedicated herself entirely to her son. However, she was still very young and must have felt that something was missing from her life. So, soon enough, Marcus Giles entered her life. Ashley and Marcus started dating and moved in together in Vancouver, Washington. While Ashley's family was initially glad to hear about the new man in her life, they began to notice changes in her. She, who had always been very open, preferred not to delve into the details of her new relationship. So only deeply concerning rumors reached her family. Marcus did everything to keep Ashley away from her family and friends, not allowing her to use their car, even though Ashley was the one paying for it, all the bills, and the apartment rent. In other words, the man was living off her money while dictating what she should do. Of course, Ashley's father and stepmother tried to bring up this issue during their rare meetings with their daughter, but there was little they could do as she was of legal age. In reality, things were much worse, and Ashley's parents found out about it in September 2013 when the terrified girl called her father. Through tears, she cried to Michael that Marcus had attacked her. She was locked in the bathroom and couldn't get out. Michael called Marcus and threatened him with physical harm if he didn't release his daughter. Immediately after the conversation with the young man, he contacted the police and rushed to Vancouver. When Michael arrived, Ashley and her son had already managed to escape from the apartment through the window. But now it became clear to him that his daughter was experiencing relationship violence. She had scratches on her face, a bruise under her eye, and a split lip. Ashley agreed to temporarily move out of the apartment, but soon everything returned to its place, and she continued living with Marcus. Her family tried to convince her to at least take a break from him, and sometimes it seemed like she was ready to do that. But months passed, and nothing changed. By that time, the decisions made by Ashley began to worry Marlon's father. He went to court regarding custody of the child, and the judge ruled in his favor. At the same time, Ashley's family was concerned that there was something in their daughter's life that they didn't know about. Unfortunately, their intuition was not wrong. Christmas of 2014 arrived. Ashley's son spent time with Marlon and his family, while the young woman herself came to give gifts to her relatives. She was brought by Marcus, but he sat in the car and didn't even enter the girl's parents' house. It seemed that Ashley was in high spirits, but she couldn't stay for long. Explaining that they planned to watch a movie with Marcus and maybe a few friends and have a quiet evening, she left. The rest of Ashley's family spent the rest of the holiday as usual. They couldn't even imagine that they had a reason to worry about the girl until the next morning, when Marcus called them. The young man informed them that he couldn't get in touch with Ashley. Michael and Jody knew that Ashley had a habit of letting her phone completely run out of battery. Plus, she never kept track of time. Usually, after a few hours, she would call back as if nothing had happened. They were confident that this was one of those cases, but they still began calling their daughter, trying to reach her. However, as time passed, their concern grew. It was at that moment they received a call. And this call not only shattered their world, but also explained why they felt that Ashley was hiding something from them. While Michael and Jody were increasingly anxious, a few kilometers away, the staff at the DoubleTree Hotel in Portland was experiencing a different kind of crisis. The morning started as usual during the busy holiday season, but then everything changed abruptly. Around 11 a.m., a hotel staff member found a body in the stairwell on the 8th floor. Just behind the door, he saw a young woman lying motionless on the floor. It was clear that she couldn't be helped anymore. When detectives arrived, they immediately noticed that the young woman was dressed inappropriately for the cold winter. She wore dark pants and a white blouse without a coat or jacket, and without shoes or socks. There were no bags, phones, or documents with her. Therefore, investigators assumed that she was a hotel guest, and her belongings must have been left in her room. She had no visible injuries except for marks on her neck, suggesting she hadn't fallen down the stairs, but was likely strangled. This assumption would soon be confirmed. The young woman's nails also caught their attention. It was clear that she had recently had a bright manicure for the holidays, but most of the nails on her left hand were broken, and there was no nail on her left index finger. However, they couldn't find any nails near her body. This led the police to conclude that they were dealing with a murder, and the victim had fiercely fought her attacker. But the murder didn't occur in the stairwell. However, after speaking with the hotel staff, the investigation hit a roadblock. No one could remember the victim. As far as they knew, no one matching her description had checked in or out. They also learned that a new surveillance system was being installed in the building, and the cameras weren't operational yet. This meant that the police had to rely on old-fashioned methods without the aid of video footage. With no other options, the officers started going room to room, knocking on doors and talking to guests. It was a time-consuming and challenging task, given that the hotel was nearly full on the holiday, and there were 10 floors to cover. They started with the rooms closest to the 8th floor, believing that the murderer likely wanted to move the body as little as possible to avoid drawing attention from potential witnesses. Most guests used the elevator, but someone from the staff could have used the stairs. Fortunately, the officers didn't have to go through all the hotel rooms. The front desk staff recalled that a woman had been calling them all morning, inquiring about her friend. She knew that her friend was staying in room 715 with a man named Chris. Officers asked the staff to check the registration log, and they found that room 715 was registered to a Chris Yoon. Chris Yoon had reserved the room for December 26th, but he had arrived a day earlier and asked if he could check in sooner, which was accommodated. He had paid in cash and left before the body was discovered, simply leaving the keys at the front desk without formally checking out. This situation raised an interesting legal nuance. Since the man had vacated the room on his own, they couldn't obtain a search warrant in his name because once he left, the room became public property. Fortunately, the hotel chose to cooperate fully with the police and allowed them to inspect the room. The room appeared relatively clean, with only 2 socks and a pizza box in the trash. However, while crime scene investigators were taking photographs, they made a chilling discovery: a piece of acrylic nail that matched the one found on the unidentified victim. Now, investigators were confident they were heading in the right direction. With heightened suspicions, the police turned their attention to Chris Yoon and discovered that he lived in a multi-apartment building in Bellevue, Washington. At the same time, officers discovered whether any calls had been made from room 715 and found another lead. Calls had been made from the room based on an advertisement posted on the Backpage website. This website often featured ads from women offering escort services, and this particular ad turned out to be one of those. The woman went by the name Veronica. The attached photos matched the victim found on the stairwell landing. Her real name was unlikely to be Veronica, but she wouldn't remain an unidentified victim for long. The floor-by-floor search had paid off entirely. Near an ice cream vending machine, officers found a purse, and in it were documents with a photo of the victim and the name Ashley Renee Benson. Detectives delivered the news to Ashley's family. They were utterly devastated. They had to confront not only their daughter's death, but also the fact that she had led a double life. The family had been concerned about her relationship with Marcus, but it turned out that there were far more difficulties in her life. They couldn't understand why she hadn't come to them with her problems. Given that her secret nightlife came as a surprise to them, they couldn't provide any information about how she ended up at the hotel. As far as they knew, she was planning to watch a movie with Marcus. However, they advised the detectives to speak with Marlon and Marcus. Marlon was quickly ruled out as a suspect. Since Ashley was killed on Christmas Day, Marlon had spent the day with his family and could prove it. He was aware that Ashley had been providing escort services. This was precisely why he had been fighting for custody of their son, and the judge had ruled in his favor. She believed that if Ashley couldn't make informed decisions for herself, she wouldn't be able to do so for her young son either. The judge also recognized that Ashley was a very intelligent, pleasant, and loving mother, and tried to reach out to her, explaining that such a lifestyle often led to negative consequences. It was like talking to a brick wall. On the other hand, it was understandable why the family's suspicions turned to Marcus. He had mistreated Ashley, and they suspected he controlled various aspects of her life. Investigators learned that Marcus had prior run-ins with the police, including assault charges. His alibi wasn't as solid as Marlon's. According to his statement, after dropping Ashley off at the hotel, he spent some time at home playing video games. And of course, no one could verify this. But before the detectives could fully digest this new information, they received yet another lead. And this one was simply incredible. They got a call from the hotel. Chris Yoon had just checked in again. When the detectives arrived at the hotel, the man was just leaving his room. They detained him. He couldn't understand what was happening but agreed to go to the police station. However, as they began to question him, the detectives quickly realized that something wasn't right. He seemed genuinely shocked that the police considered him involved in a murder. He had no knowledge of anyone named Ashley Benson, and most importantly, he hadn't been anywhere near the hotel until that day, December 26th. Furthermore, since everyone in the country was celebrating Christmas, he had plenty of witnesses, his family and friends, who could confirm that he was at home in Bellevue, Washington. He had a multitude of photos that corroborated his story, and he insisted that the police take his fingerprints and DNA. Chris explained that he was a DJ and had come to Portland for work, along with his fiancée. They had booked the room for December 26th, 2 months in advance. The detectives were baffled. Everything pointed to him as the killer, but Chris Yoon clearly couldn't have been in 2 places at once. Or could he? The detectives were beginning to realize that they would have to release their main suspect when suddenly one of them had an epiphany. He asked the man if he happened to know someone by the same name by sheer coincidence. Chris quickly replied no, but then he paused. In fact, in the same apartment complex in Bellevue, there was another Chris Yoon. The 2 men weren't related. What's more, their last names were spelled slightly differently, but pronounced the same. The detectives couldn't believe such an unbelievable coincidence. They pressed for details and found out that the man who arrived in Portland on December 25th had shown his driver's license with the name Tae Bum, Chris Yoon. The spelling of the last names didn't match, but he calmly explained that it was a typographical error. The hotel staff didn't find it strange. He paid in cash and went to his room. The detectives got even more incriminating evidence when they found Ashley's phone. The phone pinged, indicating that it was still somewhere near the hotel. The police combed the area and found it in a trash bin about a block and a half from the hotel. In it, they discovered a multitude of messages sent by Chris to Ashley. The messages revealed that Chris had been a regular client of Ashley's for several months, and he had called and messaged her dozens of times on Christmas Day alone. However, tensions had been mounting between them before her death. Part of it was about money, and part of it was because Chris had become increasingly possessive of her, pressuring her to leave her current lifestyle and become his girlfriend. Each time Chris met with Ashley, he showered her with thousands of dollars, gifts, and extravagant restaurant visits. In return, he demanded that she have no other men in her life. Shortly before her murder, Chris sent her an email in which he wrote, "I will clarify everything before you read my message. I am determined to compensate you for all the time you spent on me. Before you cast me as guilty, I want you to know that you broke our agreement. You posted a new ad, and though I forgave you, I found other ads." From this email, it was clear that Ashley had promised Chris that she wouldn't post escort ads anymore, but Chris had discovered that she had deceived him. Now, the investigators were convinced that they had not only found the person responsible for Ashley's murder, but also understood his motive. They suspected that on the night of the murder, Chris had demanded that Ashley quit escorting for good, but she refused, declaring that she didn't want to see him anymore. In a fit of rage, he strangled her and left her body on the staircase. Everything was falling into place, but there was an obvious problem. Nobody knew where Chris was. He wasn't at his apartment in Bellevue, which he had rented just a month ago, and it was nearly empty of furniture. Chris's parents believed he was attending college and had no idea where their son was. Meanwhile, detectives learned that early on the morning of December 26th, Chris had attempted to check into another hotel. He was sweaty, and his face and neck were covered in numerous scratches. The clerk asked him what had happened, and he replied that he had argued with his family and he needed a place to get away from them. Chris wasn't given a room because he wanted to pay in cash, so he called a taxi and checked into a different Portland hotel. When the police finally obtained a search warrant and tracked Chris's cell phone, they arrived at this hotel too late. He had already left. However, while in the hotel, he had called other women who provided escort services. Now, investigators were worried that if they didn't act quickly, they might have 2 murders on their hands. Studying Chris's life, the detectives knew he often traveled on Amtrak trains, shuttling between Washington and Oregon. This turned out to be one of the final missing pieces that would allow them to capture him. Around 2 weeks after Ashley's murder, on January 7, 2015, investigators learned that Chris had checked into another hotel in the Portland area and had purchased a ticket to travel to Washington on the same day. Police split into 2 teams, with one heading to the hotel and the other to the Portland Union Station. As they approached the hotel, the detectives saw Chris Yun exit the building and get into a taxi. They rushed inside and asked the clerk if he knew the taxi driver and if he had the driver's phone number. The clerk called the driver and discreetly asked where they were headed. The police couldn't believe it when they discovered that Chris Yun was returning to the scene of the crime. While sitting in the car, they speculated about his intentions. Some murderers liked to return to the scene of their crimes to relive the emotions they felt during the act. However, it was more likely that he simply wanted to retrieve Ashley's purse, which the officers had already found, because Chris quickly entered and exited the hotel without incident. He got back into the taxi and headed straight for the train station, where he was surrounded by officers. The first thing he said to them was, "How did you find me?" During the interrogation, Chris behaved quite calmly, politely, and even modestly. He admitted that he had always found it difficult to communicate with women. He met Ashley several months ago when he called her in response to an ad. Chris did want her to be his girlfriend, but he denied being obsessed with her. He described their encounter on December 25th and admitted that they had argued about money. However, as soon as the detectives began to ask questions about the murder, he clammed up and demanded a lawyer. But what was particularly interesting was that Chris talked about Marcus. According to Chris Yun, Marcus was not Ashley's boyfriend at all. He not only knew about her escort work, but he was behind it all, controlling her both emotionally and physically, and forcing her into this activity. While it might seem like an attempt on Chris Yun's part to shift responsibility onto someone else, by this point, he was not the only one making such statements to the police. Some of Ashley's friends who knew about her work were aware of Marcus's involvement in it as well. Clearly, Ashley became a victim of human trafficking. People like Marcus are often referred to as Romeo pimps. They pretend to be boyfriends, but in reality, they manipulate vulnerable girls, often young single mothers, making them fall in love and then exploiting them, forcing them to earn money for them. Although such allegations are challenging to prove, Ashley herself admitted during a custody hearing a few months before her death that the money she earned went towards covering all the expenses for both her and Marcus, including rent and a car, the very car she was not allowed to drive. Initially, Marcus denied any involvement in Ashley's work, but gradually, he changed his statements, eventually admitting who Chris Yun was and revealing that he had driven Ashley to the hotel on the night of her murder. However, despite all of the above, there was no evidence to suggest that Marcus was directly involved in the murder. Only he treated Ashley as his property, unfortunately, much like Chris Yun, spending thousands of dollars on her, sometimes even giving her more than $5,000 at a time. Chris believed he had the right to dictate what Ashley should do. According to the detectives, when he arrived at the hotel that night, even if he wasn't firmly intent on killing her, he didn't rule out that possibility. Therefore, according to the police's theory, he either hacked into the other Chris Yun's email or somehow learned that the other Chris Yun was coming to Portland and decided to use his booked room number, possibly even framing him, a namesake, for the murder. During the search of his apartment and his phone, the police found evidence that he was involved in the illegal drug trade. This explained where he got the thousands of dollars he often gave to Ashley, despite having no job, while his parents believed he was a student. Although he initially insisted on his innocence and stated that he would contest the charges against him, he later agreed to a plea deal. In 2017, Tae Bom-yoon, or as he preferred to call himself, Chris Yoon, pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter in the first degree and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. It is clear that he was not charged with any drug-related offenses, but the exact reasons for this are not entirely clear. It's possible that these were conditions of his plea deal. Charges of human trafficking against Marcus Giles were not proven in court. The Benson family filed a lawsuit against the owners of the hotel and the website where Ashley's advertisements were posted. Ashley's relatives claimed that these companies failed to conduct their business in a way that would prevent human trafficking, which ultimately led to Ashley's death. The Department of Justice subsequently closed the Backpage website, citing its facilitation and promotion of human trafficking. Unfortunately, the police discovered that whatever was happening in Ashley's life could have been going on for years. 4 years before her death, she was dating another guy, Latrell Poston, who was later charged with human trafficking. Latrell was 21 years old when he was sentenced to nearly 25 years in prison. Detectives revealed that he treated his victims as his property, much like Marcus did. Latrell also claimed to be Ashley's boyfriend, and even after his arrest, Ashley continued to send him profits from her work, although not always willingly. For example, according to court records, on August 11, 2011, Latrell called Ashley and asked where she was. She replied that she was doing a manicure at a salon. He then started shouting, if she doesn't put money into his prison account, he will beat her mother. How could she be so close to the prison and not bring the money? What did she feel? Ashley's father, Michael Benson, wondered, what did they say to her to make her do all these things or keep quiet about it? After their daughter's murder, Michael and Jody often received calls from other young women trapped in human trafficking. These women were looking for answers to their own questions. These girls feel like there is no way out, and at some point they will also be killed, Jody says. I tell them, I know you were threatened, but our daughter didn't turn to us for help, and look where it got her. It's one of those cases that leaves a dual feeling for a number of reasons. On one hand, it was a great example of coordinated and skilled police work. Detectives and prosecutors managed to find the killer and secure his conviction. On the other hand, it's disheartening that despite having a loving family that genuinely cared for Ashley, worried about her, and wished the best for her, most of the men in her life treated her as something to exploit for their own purposes. It makes you wonder if all the criminals involved in this case got what they deserved. What motive for murder would you consider the most trivial? Betrayal, jealousy, or money? Don't rush to answer. This is a tricky question. After all, a jealous person might turn out to be greedy, and an unfaithful wife may burn with jealousy herself. When in a love triangle, each person has their own motive for murder, it won't be easy for the police to figure it out. And then even a killer who no one would dare to call very smart will manage to lead the investigation for 467 days. Growing up in Amarillo, Texas, Robin knew exactly what she wanted in life, even as a child. She wanted to stay at home and take care of her children while her husband provided for the family. Her parents, both military veterans, had a happy marriage that lasted for 40 years, and she dreamed of having a similar relationship. However, things didn't go as planned because she often chose the wrong partners and avoided the good ones as if they were a danger. But above all, Robin feared being alone. She hated being alone, and she was afraid of being alone. Fortunately, thanks to her sociable nature, she got a job as a waitress in a restaurant where there was no shortage of attention from men. And so one evening in 2003, at the age of 22, Robin met a wonderful young man named Jeremy David Spielbauer. Though everyone simply called him JD, 21-year-old JD was gentle, caring, and exceptionally polite. He served in the Marine Corps and had been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. He also found work as a mechanic in civilian life. Needless to say, Robin fell head over heels in love with him. Just 2 months later, she joyfully announced to her parents that she and JD were expecting a child. Her parents had only just learned that she was dating someone, but they chose not to argue. Robin moved into JD's and his mother's house. After the birth of their daughter, they decided to get married. Soon, their second daughter was born. However, as is often the case, financial difficulties made life increasingly challenging for the growing family, and conflicts became inevitable. Then, to the surprise of their friends and family, the family began attending the local church about 3 times a week. There, they made new acquaintances, including a young mother of 2, Katie. The girls quickly became friends, but Robin's friend Erin House looked with suspicion upon JD's newfound religious devotion. She believed that their church attendance was a more trivial reason, a desire to see Katie more often. Unfortunately, she was right. Robin stubbornly turned a blind eye to everything until the day her husband moved in with his lover. Approximately 8 years into their marriage, Robin filed for divorce and returned to live with her parents. JD and Katie got married on November 10th, the founding day of the Marine Corps. Now, JD helped Katie raise her 2 children, but it was clear that Robin hadn't forgotten her ex-husband until she became interested in Jared. It was evident that the young man genuinely liked Robin, and her friends, especially Erin, were very happy for her. Robin at last regained her old self, rejoiced, and smiled happily, just like before. It seemed like a happy family and a cozy nest were on the horizon for the girl. But this glimmer of hope quickly dimmed one night in April 2014 when Robin got into her car and drove away, never to return home. On the morning of April 8, 2014, Robin's mother noticed her daughter was missing. She assumed that she had stayed with one of her friends, as she had done in the past, and felt somewhat irritated because she needed to go to work and didn't know who would take her grandchild to school. At that moment, it didn't even occur to her that something might have happened to her daughter. On the same day, around noon, a local businessman was driving on the highway when he turned onto Helium Road, and 3 girls ran towards him shouting, "She's dead! She's dead!" The man contacted the rescue service after the girls told him that they had seen a black Chevrolet Tahoe with a girl lying near the rear wheel. She wasn't breathing and wasn't moving. The officers who arrived at the scene concluded that the poor girl had been there for several hours and had suffered a blow to the head with a blunt object. She had no identification, wallet, or phone with her. However, the license plate of the vehicle helped identify the victim as Robin Spielbauer. Robin's parents had to break the terrible news to her daughters and her ex-husband. JD couldn't believe what had happened and couldn't hold back his tears. He immediately went to the family to support the children and his former in-laws. At the same time, the investigators were examining the crime scene. One unusual detail they noticed was the damage to the car's glass. The rear right door's glass had chips and bright pink paint marks. What did this suggest? It indicated that someone had struck the car's glass with a heavy and pink object. However, the detectives had no idea what significance this discovery would have in their investigation. Therefore, they began questioning Robin's acquaintances. Her boyfriend Jared stated that after work, he went home, played video games, and went to sleep. JD also claimed that he was at home, had 2 glasses of beer, and fell asleep. He hadn't come anywhere near Helium Road that evening and had no idea where Robin might have gone, why, or with whom. However, his phone told a completely different story. According to his text messages, he and his ex-wife were planning to meet that evening. The man had to admit that his wife had gone to her friend's place with their son. He had arranged to meet Robin at his home to discuss their children and wanted his uncle to be there in case his wife returned early. However, he forgot about the meeting and simply fell asleep on the couch after his uncle left. He woke up shortly before 10 p.m. with a strange, oppressive feeling. JD messaged his wife and his uncle, asking if everything was okay. At 10:18, he also messaged Robin, but she didn't respond. He tried calling her, but it went to voicemail. Just a few minutes after JD called his ex-wife, Katie arrived at the house. JD's uncle, who had returned to calm his agitated nephew, confirmed that she arrived around 10:20. They talked for a bit, as JD was still feeling uneasy. The detectives noticed that JD seemed to be trying to hint at something and directly stated that he was raising many suspicions. In response, the man claimed that he had his own suspicions but didn't specify what they were. The investigators had no doubt that JD was hiding something, and as they delved into his life, they discovered what it could be. JD had been married to Robin, but he had an affair with Katie. He then divorced Robin, married Katie, and started a new affair, this time with Robin. JD claimed they maintained friendly relations for the sake of the children, but Katie suspected there was more between him and his ex-wife. JD and Katie argued nearly every day, and Robin found it amusing. She wanted Katie to take her own medicine. The 2 women fought for a man they both considered a traitor, and what made him worth fighting for remained a mystery. Robin's friend Aaron even recalled an incident in 2013 when Robin came to Katie's house to pick up the girls. Katie grabbed and pushed her down the stairs, climbed on top, and started beating her. Robin managed to push her off. When Aaron heard about this, she warned her friend not to be alone with Katie because she was one of those crazies who could kill her. 5 months after that fight, Robin was dead. The investigators, of course, spoke with Katie. She admitted not liking Robin, but claimed she never threatened her. However, she stumbled on the same issue her husband did, her own text messages, and not just 1 or 2 messages. In the 4 days leading up to the murder, Katie sent her husband 336 angry messages. It was clear that she was furious and struggling to find a way to vent her anger. Less than an hour before the murder, she sent the following message to her husband. "My dreams of a happy family have evaporated. I won't force you to continue bearing this burden. You started it, whether you want to believe it or not. I will end it." Statements like these, in the eyes of the investigators, turned the jealous wife into a murder suspect. However, Katie had not only a motive, but also an alibi. She and her son spent the evening at her friend Savannah Guinness's house. They left around 10 p.m. and returned home at 10:20, which was confirmed by JD and his uncle. Furthermore, there was no evidence connecting her to the crime scene, at least not at that point. On the same day that investigators were interrogating Katie, the forensic expert conducted an autopsy on Robin. At the crime scene, it appeared that she had died from a severe blow to the head with a blunt object, but the autopsy revealed something more. A .22 caliber bullet had been fired into the back of the victim's head. Now the police began searching for the weapon. Robin's parents, who lived just a few houses away from Katie and JD, watched as the police conducted a search in their former son-in-law's home. The family had an entire arsenal in the house, which was quite common for Texas. However, one small detail caught a lot of attention: a pistol with a bright pink frame, the same caliber as the bullet that killed Robin. A piece of plastic had broken off the pistol. Therefore, the investigators returned to the crime scene and combed the area around where they found the car. They discovered a .22 caliber shell casing and 2 bright pink plastic fragments that obviously matched the pistol. What was particularly intriguing was that before they found the weapon, but after the murder, the investigators had browsed Katie's Facebook page and found a photo of her shooting the very same pink pistol. However, before they could realize the significance of this discovery, she deleted the photo. It seemed like Katie didn't want the police to know about the weapon. But why? Detectives took a closer look at where she was at the time of the murder. You may remember, she had an alibi. She and her son spent the evening with Savannah's family and left at 10 p.m. However, Savannah told them that Katie and her son had left at 9:50 or around that time. Just 10 minutes, but they were crucial. It only takes from 3 to 5 minutes to drive from Savannah's house to Helium Road. These 10 minutes cast doubt on Katie's alibi, and her best friend was the one who brought it to light. There was more. At 10:13, Katie's phone pinged at a tower that could be considered close to both Savannah's house and the crime scene. This meant that Katie had the means, opportunity, and motive to commit the murder. The police believed they had everything they needed for an arrest. They arrested Katie in front of her 12-year-old son, Diego. By the way, as all witnesses confirmed, Katie was with her son the entire evening. Wouldn't he have noticed if his mother had stopped the car in the middle of a field, had an argument with someone, and then committed a murder? Especially since Robin had not only been shot, but also struck with a blunt object on the head. The teenager surely would have noticed. But when he was questioned, he said that all he remembered was sitting in the car with his mom and playing games on his phone while they drove around the city. Thus, on April 11, 2014, just 4 days after the murder, the investigators informed Robin's parents about the arrest. Robin's loved ones lost a daughter and a friend. But the consolation for them was that the person responsible for her death, Katie Spielbauer, was behind bars. Is the case closed? Not quite. Katie remained in jail, unable to post bail, while investigators and District Attorney James Farron built their case against her. They soon received assistance from an unexpected source. JD came to the police station and stated something he had maintained all along. He had been at home with his uncle when he received a message from Robin proposing a meetup on Helium Road. This time, JD added to his story by saying that just after 9 p.m., Katie returned home. She was in a bad mood and started an argument. JD, not wanting to fight, went to his bedroom and lay down. When he woke up, he found that his wife had left in his car. That was when a terrible feeling of dread overcame him, and he decided to check if everything was all right. JD and his uncle received responses from Katie, confirming everything was fine, but there was no response from Robin. When the detectives asked JD why he decided to tell them about this now, he explained that the thought of his wife being involved in Robin's murder was driving him insane. The investigators challenged JD's story, which contradicted phone records available to the police. JD's phone pinged at 9:23 while he was on his way to the crime scene. JD then explained that someone else had taken his phone and his car. It was Katie. She saw his messages with his lover and took his phone, his car, and went to confront Robin. But why did Katie hit the car's rear right window with a gun? The detectives were convinced that it was likely the lovers had met on Helium Road, sitting in the back seat of the car when Katie arrived. She fired her gun before JD could react, and now he was torn between his loyalty to Katie and his desire for justice for Robin. After a few more days, JD finally agreed to tell everything. JD and Robin had met on Helium Road, sitting in the car and just talking about the kids. When they noticed headlights approaching, they heard a loud knock on the window, obviously not made by a fist. JD opened the door, and it was Katie. The girls immediately started arguing. JD demanded they stop fighting and reassured Katie that they were just talking about the children. He then went to his car and drove home, convinced that Katie would follow him, but he was wrong. So he sent 2 text messages, asking if everything was okay. JD explained that he hadn't told anyone earlier because he didn't want to believe it, as he still loved Katie, but now it was all over. He filed for divorce and never visited his wife in jail, as she was going to be there for a long time unless she could prove her innocence. When investigators took on the case, it seemed simple and straightforward. It took them 4 days to link Katie to the murder. The prosecutor believed that after some time in jail, Katie would confess. However, even her husband's admission didn't help. Katie demanded a polygraph test. The police provided her with that opportunity, and she took another one. She failed it miserably, but it didn't break her. She still refused to confess. Katie didn't deny her animosity towards her rival, but claimed she would never kill her or arrange someone else to commit murder. The reason lay in her tragic upbringing. Her father died when she was 2, and she buried her mother at 18. Knowing the hardships of growing up without parents, she would never do such a thing to Robin's children. All the evidence against Katie was circumstantial, and they needed something more solid. That's when a breakthrough happened. In the prosecutor's office, someone mentioned a case where smartphones could leave digital footprints when connecting to Wi-Fi networks. Katie's phone had its Wi-Fi turned off, but her son Diego's phone had it on. This meant that investigators could track Diego's every move and, consequently, that of his mother that night. Since all the witnesses consistently stated that the teenager was always with his mother, tracing Diego's phone could lead them to Katie. The prosecutor instructed his assistants to obtain this information, and it took months to do so. When the data was finally acquired, the prosecutor met with Katie. By that time, she had spent 467 days in jail, awaiting trial. The prosecutor told Katie that he considered this information the final piece needed. He was confident that it would send her to prison for life, but it turned out to be the key to her freedom, allowing her to reunite with her children. She couldn't believe it, breaking down in tears due to the overwhelming emotions. She admitted that during her time in jail, she had harbored the darkest thoughts, fearing that if she were found guilty, she would have to be carried out in a body bag. She would prefer her children to believe their mother had passed away rather than having her incarcerated for murder. Suddenly, with the snap of fingers, she was free. Within hours, the case against her was closed, and she was released. A happy ending? Not quite, as if Katie was innocent. It meant that someone else got away with murder. The prosecutor publicly admitted his mistake. He realized that JD had outsmarted him simply because everyone underestimated him, believing he wasn't clever enough to orchestrate a murder. Although there was a small arsenal in his home, he chose the pink gun, which often jammed after the first shot, solely because it belonged to Katie. He could have disposed of it in the desert where it might never be found, but he brought it back home. Moreover, surveillance cameras captured a car similar to his near the crime scene at approximately the time of the murder. Although the face and license plate weren't visible, investigators were convinced it was JD behind the wheel, and no car remotely resembling Katie's was seen there. But the most significant lie he told was not about the night of the murder, but his past. JD had never served in the Marine Corps or any other military branch, nor had he been to Iraq or Afghanistan. All those stories were fabrications to impress women like Katie, whose parents had military ties, something that spoke volumes about his character. The prosecutor was certain that at some point before Robin's murder, she had told J.D. that she had met someone else and they would no longer be lovers. Additionally, she had expressed her desire to finally receive full child support payments. J.D.'s scheme was simple: kill Robin to get rid of her, frame Katie to eliminate her as well, and then remain financially stable while finding a younger and more agreeable girlfriend. This would solve all his problems. However, the prosecutor hesitated to press charges, and 9 months later, Robin's mother called him. It turned out J.D. had asked her to do him a favor and buy him a ticket to New York, claiming he needed to go there for the weekend. Presumably, he planned to flee since it was just a short distance from New York to the Canadian border. This prompted the prosecutor to take action, but an arrest doesn't equal a conviction. That's why he took another unexpected step by inviting Katie as a witness in the case. The prosecutor was confident that his earlier mistake would now help convict J.D. Robin was killed with a pink gun, and either J.D. or Katie had to be the murderer. It was certainly not Katie. The defense argued that if Robin had been severely beaten and then shot, it pointed towards Katie as the perpetrator because both actions could have killed her, suggesting the murderer was in a state of rage. Moreover, J.D. couldn't have framed Katie easily because he wasn't smart enough for such a plan. If he wanted to frame his wife, he would have ensured that she had no alibi. J.D. could have been sentenced to death if the jury believed that the crime included a robbery because Robin's phone and wallet went missing, and later, her daughter's documents were found in J.D.'s car. However, the jury decided that this was more likely a theft than a robbery. Therefore, he was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after April 20th, 2046, when he would be 63 years old. Justice was served for Robin, but her parents still felt the pain of the thought that their daughter's greatest fear came true when J.D. left her alone on that remote road. In January 2020, the case took an unexpected turn. The appellate court overturned J.D.'s conviction. It turned out that 2 jurors had formed opinions about the defendant and the case before the trial, which was not allowed by the procedure. Additionally, J.D. had complained about the performance of his lawyers. In 2021, the court found no issues with the jury selection process. However, the case was once again sent back to the appellate court to assess J.D.'s complaint about his attorneys. It's important to note that the appellate court did not conclude that the man was innocent, but rather that there was a procedural error. Even if J.D.'s trial is conducted again, Katie, who currently works at a law firm, has promised to be present on behalf of Robin to ensure that justice prevails once more. Katie herself has become the director of a company that helps teenagers and adults overcome emotional and physical traumas and change their lives for the better through sports. Bonnie and Jim Hood, an affluent couple from Newport Beach, California, believed they had fulfilled their long-held dream when they acquired the abandoned Camp Nelson Hotel in the Sierra Nevada mountains. However, during the hotel's restoration, Bonnie garnered many enemies among the local residents who opposed the changes. As tension escalated, violence erupted, resulting in 2 murders. But is everything as straightforward as it seems? At that moment, investigators had yet to realize that before the case would be solved, it would take more sharp turns than the Serpentine Road to Camp Nelson itself. Jim Hood, the son of one of the General Electric executives, and Bonnie Jean Marr met at the University of California. After their education, Jim accepted a civil service offer in Vietnam, while Bonnie worked as a flight attendant on planes transporting military personnel to Japan and Taiwan. Their long-distance relationship only deepened their feelings, and in the 1960s, they married and settled in Newport Beach, where they brought 2 wonderful children into the world, Mindy and Jim Jr. Jim quickly found success in real estate, while Bonnie pursued a career as a realtor. They weren't afraid of their own ambitions and embraced adventurous projects, which made them a fantastic duo. People believed they had earned their success through hard and diligent work. It seemed like things couldn't get any better. However, gradually Bonnie came to the realization that she yearned for something entirely different. She felt born for a life in the countryside and dreamt of settling near mountains. Mountains always held a special place in Bonnie's heart. When she was a child, her father would take the family to Camp Nelson for the summers. And when she learned that the old hotel there was up for sale, she immediately became passionate about the idea of turning the abandoned property into an exclusive resort that would attract affluent clients to the small town. At first, it was just a wild idea, but it so inspired her that Jim decided to help his wife make her dream come true. Jim and Bonnie acquired the hotel and embarked on an unexpected family experiment. Bonnie started dividing her time between the hotel in the Sierra Nevada mountains and her home in Newport Beach. Despite the fact that the family only gathered in full on weekends, Bonnie managed to be constantly present in her husband and children's lives. They regularly communicated over the phone, and she even checked the kids' homework, which they faxed to her. It was unconventional, but the spouses wanted each family member to be happy, pursuing what they were passionate about. Bonnie loved taking on challenges, tackling complex projects, and the hotel was one of them. Immersing herself in the work, she was driven, but being an outsider in the town, she had no idea what she had gotten herself into. Soon she clashed with the loggers who were clearing the forest on the hotel's grounds. At that time, logging was a primary source of income for many locals seeking to expand their businesses, but Bonnie stood against the destruction of the beautiful forest. As if this wasn't enough, during a horseback ride through the woods, she stumbled upon a different kind of enterprise, a secretive and highly dangerous one. She came across a clearing being used as a marijuana cultivation site. Bonnie reported her findings to the police. Tensions escalated to the point where Bonnie compiled dossiers on every person she had conflicts with. She simply wanted to mind her own business and thwart the illicit activities and destruction of the pristine forest. However, the locals believed it wasn't her concern, and that she shouldn't be assembling folders of dirt on people she found disagreeable. But despite quarrels and even threats, Bonnie fell in love with the hotel and the Sierra Nevada mountains. She was resolute in transforming the hotel into the spa resort she knew it could be. It was a challenging and ambitious project, and Bonnie hired an assistant named Rudy Manuel to help her out. Just 3 years later, with her husband's support, Bonnie was on the brink of opening the exclusive resort when a horrifying crime shattered the Hood family's world. At 3 a.m. on August 19, 1990, an unknown assailant broke into Bonnie's room and shot 2 people sleeping in the bed. Bonnie was shot in the temple and died on the spot, while her employee, Rudy Manuel, though wounded in the head, was still alive. Despite there being several $100s in Bonnie's purse and valuables on the table, nothing appeared to be missing. The murder seemed more like an execution than a random robbery gone awry. Apart from a shoe print on the floor, there were no other clues pointing to the killer. It became apparent that someone had come for these individuals, but whether Bonnie or Rudy was the target remained unclear. Though Rudy survived, the doctor's prognosis was uncertain. As a result, a police officer was stationed at the hospital in hopes that the injured man would recover. The residents of the tiny town of Camp Nelson were shocked when they learned about the brutal attack and speculated about the secrets the victims had hidden, prompting someone to resort to murder. The circumstances in which the victims were found left little doubt that they had crossed the line between friendship and intimacy. Bonnie and Rudy were discovered nearly naked in bed at 3 a.m. Moreover, the autopsy confirmed their intimate relationship. What drove Bonnie to engage in a romantic liaison with her assistant? Rudy was the complete opposite of James Hood. He worked with his hands, was a Native American, dressed casually, was comfortable getting into fights, and was accustomed to working the land rather than in an office. They spent virtually all of their time together during the 5 days of the week and gradually fell in love. Interestingly, those around them noticed this even before their relationship became a reality. The main question was whether Bonnie's husband had any inkling about the affair. Could he have discovered his wife's infidelity and sought revenge? However, during conversations with detectives, Jim seemed genuinely sincere, asserting that he had no knowledge of his wife's secret romance. Furthermore, he had a solid alibi. He was located 400 kilometers away from the hotel, at the family home in Newport Beach, along with his children. Jim appeared utterly devastated by his wife's loss, and though deeply affected by Bonnie's unfaithfulness, he demanded justice and a swift capture of the killer. All the family's friends and acquaintances unanimously attested that he was a devoted husband and father. Additionally, the police couldn't find any witnesses or evidence linking Jim to the crime scene. As a result, he was excluded from the list of suspects. Detectives spoke with Camp Nelson residents and discovered that Bonnie was far from well-liked. She was an unyielding opponent, successfully putting an end to both logging and the sale of illicit substances, actions that involved substantial sums of money. In other words, the victim of the murder was a woman who was vehemently disliked by the locals. However, after conversing with potential suspects, they couldn't find anyone who had acted on their animosity. Therefore, they decided to consider the crime from a different angle. Could it be that Bonnie had become an accidental victim, while Rudy was the intended target? Especially considering his own checkered past and brushes with the law. He had been suspected of assaults and thefts before. Not long before the shooting, he had been accused of stealing from a local landowner who had repeatedly threatened him. However, the landowner also had an alibi, leading to his exclusion from the list of suspects. But then, another possibility emerged. Stories began circulating about a mysterious stranger who appeared in town on the day of the murder. In a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other, an outsider stood out noticeably. Moreover, his appearance was distinctive, a tall, red-haired man with a beard. He entered a bar, drank heavily, and even got into a fight. However, the police had no idea of his identity, nor did they know whether he had any connection to the crime. Perhaps he had ended up in the town by pure coincidence. This was their first lead, and the one person who could help was Rudy. He might have seen the killer before the shots were fired. Rudy spent 2 days in a coma, and the police officers didn't leave his hospital bedside for a moment. Finally, he regained consciousness. Fortunately, he remembered everything and described the man who shot at him and Bonnie. It was a tall, red-haired, bearded man, the stranger that the locals had described. Now the police had a suspect, but he was a phantom, disappearing from the town as quickly as he had appeared. How do you find a person without a name? He had been drinking beer at the bar, which meant he could have left behind fingerprints. However, finding the right bottle in the bar was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Nevertheless, the investigators sent hundreds of bottles to the lab, hoping to find a fingerprint that wouldn't match any of the locals. The chances were slim, but sometimes luck is on the police's side. On one of the bottles, they found a fingerprint belonging to a man with a criminal record. He had a history of getting into fights, using both alcohol and illicit substances, owning weapons, and was likely involved in drug dealing. Rudy identified him from a photo. The enigmatic shooter was named Bruce E. Beauchamp. The police found Bruce at his home in Fontana, California. He didn't even attempt to deny that he had been in the town, even though he could have. He claimed he had come for personal business. Supposedly, he wanted to meet a woman discreetly without his wife's knowledge, but when he couldn't meet her, he drove back. The police were convinced Bruce was lying and that he was the one who shot the 2 victims. A closer examination of his life revealed even more intriguing details. As it turned out, Bruce could have known Bonnie because he had worked as a subcontractor for her husband for several years. However, he insisted it was just a coincidence. According to him, his boss had once mentioned that Camp Nelson was a great place to relax, and he finally decided to see it for himself, which is why he was at the bar that day. He had no dealings with Bonnie, didn't sell her drugs, they weren't in a relationship, and he didn't steal her jewelry. In other words, he had no motive to kill Bonnie. Still, Bruce was charged with first-degree murder. The shoe print found near the crime scene matched a specific brand of sneakers, and investigators found a receipt for the purchase of those exact shoes in Bruce's possession. With Rudy's identification, prosecutors believed they had a solid case against the accused. If convicted, the death penalty awaited him. However, when Rudy took the witness stand, he made a fateful decision to keep one secret. When asked if he had a connection with Bonnie, he answered no, despite the physical evidence to the contrary. He had no reason to lie, and this unexpected turn shook the prosecution. By denying the romantic connection, he cast doubt on all his other statements. And when jurors have issues with the victims, they can easily doubt the guilt of the accused, even if there's no real reason for doubt. That's exactly what happened. The jury found Bruce not guilty. He walked out of the courtroom a free man, although his freedom was short-lived. Nearly a year after Bruce's acquittal, a call came into the rescue service from Jim Hood's office in Fontana. Upon arrival, the police found Bruce Beauchamp's lifeless body on the floor. He had been shot 7 times, and the shooter turned out to be none other than Jim Hood himself. He didn't deny killing Bruce and had called the police himself. However, he claimed that his action had nothing to do with revenge. He said he was defending his life, as Bruce had barged into his office wielding a weapon and attempted to kill Jim, just as he had killed his wife, Bonnie. Friends of Jim mentioned that Bruce had been harassing him with phone calls for a long time, threatening to kill him. So Jim feared for his life and prepared by hiding a pistol in his desk drawer. Jim's lawyers were confident that the court would quickly establish that he acted in self-defense and would set him free. However, things turned out to be not that simple. Bruce might have been a villain, but he was also loved. His wife knew his secrets. She became the main witness for the prosecution and revealed that shortly before her husband's death, she found $10,000 in cash in the house. She demanded explanations from him, and he reluctantly confessed to her that he had killed Bonnie Hood for $50,000, as per her husband's request. But even if the police were willing to believe this, they didn't know Jim's motive. Was the woman killed because of her infidelity? Most likely not. There were rumors that Jim's empire wasn't as strong as he portrayed it, and his wife's dream of building a luxurious spa resort took a lot of money. The hotel cost $700,000, and the renovations were much more expensive than the spouses had anticipated. Although Jim agreed to buy the hotel as a gift for his wife, he was a businessman and believed that such a gift should bring profits, not just drain money from the family budget. On the other hand, Bonnie firmly believed that her husband had the money and continued to spend on her dream as much as she wanted. After her death, Jim received about $400,000 from the insurance, which could have helped solve his problems. But Bruce disrupted his plans. He consulted his lawyer and found out that he couldn't be tried for the same crime twice, so he had nothing to fear. He could publicly claim that he shot Bonnie and Rudy, and they wouldn't even arrest him. So he started extorting money from Jim. According to the prosecution's version, on that day, the men agreed to meet in Jim's office. A friend who drove Bruce to the office recounted that Bruce took out a knife to not appear threatening if Jim called the police. He expected a difficult conversation but couldn't imagine that he would be killed. James shot Bruce twice in the head and chest. As he fell, James fired 3 more bullets into the blackmailer's body, then another 2 shots at close range into his head. After that, he placed the prepared revolver in Bruce's hand. However, no traces of blood were found on the revolver, and the forensic experts concluded that it was placed in Bruce's hand after his death. Moreover, the weapon was found in his right hand, but he was left-handed. However, the prosecution's version had several gaps. Firstly, Bruce's wife, Sharon, couldn't explain what she and her husband had spent the money on for Bonnie's murder and why they couldn't cover their debts. Her husband didn't deposit money into a bank account, and Jim also didn't withdraw such amounts from his account. Even if the woman did see the money, her husband could have lied to her about how he obtained it. Secondly, according to Jim's friends and close ones, he didn't have financial problems. He was building houses worth $8 million each, had personal savings, and right before Bonnie's murder, he bought a new car for his son with cash. Therefore, in case of financial difficulties, his wife's $400,000 insurance wouldn't have helped much. Thirdly, Bonnie kept dossiers on all the local residents with whom she had conflicts. These documents disappeared and no one knows who took them. Neither Jim nor Bruce had any reason to steal them. More likely, it was the other way around. The jurors deliberated for 20 days, yet one of them still did not believe in Jim's guilt. The members of the jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision, so the court was declared a mistrial. However, the prosecutors made a second attempt to secure Jim's conviction. The prosecutor corrected his mistakes and did not attempt to prove the motive for the murder. He didn't mention Bonnie's murder, but instead presented the evidence. Additionally, during the second trial, Jim altered his testimony slightly, prompting an unexpected move from the prosecutor. He called the jurors from the first trial as witnesses, and they testified that Jim had lied. In the second trial, Jim Hood was convicted of Bruce's murder. Although the public and the newspapers accused him of Bonnie's death as well, no formal charges were brought against him for it. His children still believe that their father was not involved in their mother's death. They consider him an easy target for the prosecutors who wanted a guilty verdict in such a high-profile case. They are shocked by the fact that Bruce, a man repeatedly accused of crimes, was set free due to the jurors' lack of conviction, while their father, who was a great husband and father, ended up being convicted. The irony of this case lies in the fact that if Bruce had been convicted, he would be alive today. However, his acquittal led to his death, which in turn resulted in Jim's conviction. Jim's request to be placed in a medium-security prison was denied. He is serving his sentence in the most dangerous and isolated prison in the state. Bonnie dreamt of creating a luxurious spa hotel in the mountains, a place where she could truly find happiness. But she was killed before her dreams could come true. James, her husband, had all the advantages in life. with doors open before him. He had a beautiful home, a wife, and children. However, the desire to keep his secrets hidden undermined this life of wealth and privilege.